Welcome back to the channel, guys. This is Outlier Fantasy. Today, we're going to do a 2024 Fantasy Football Awards show, and I'm with my co-host, Dr. Eber. Thank you so much, Dr. Eber, for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. Happy New Year to all our viewers. Happy holidays. Hope this year brings you much joy, happiness, and prosperity. The floor is yours, sir. Thank you for having me.
Of course, again, thank you so much for joining. I really do appreciate this. I love when we chop it up. So let's just get right into it. Let's talk the 2024 Fantasy All First Team studs. We're not going to go so much over where they finished position wise and take the first at each position. We're going to weigh in and factor where they were drafted ADP wise, where did they finish overall, and that's how we came up with our all first team studs. So let's just go over the overall first team all studs, and let's start with the quarterback position. We felt that the best for this role was Baker Mayfield, and this was a tough choice because there were a lot of good quarterbacks that delivered. But when you look at in terms of ADP, where all of these guys were taken, Baker Mayfield was pretty much in the middle of the pack. He was in those like late teens ADP wise. He finished overall at QB 9, I believe it is. With that, it just felt like obviously guys like Jaden Daniels, Jared Goff, like these were guys that were also in the running for this position, but it made the most sense in terms of where they were drafted and where they finished that Baker Mayfield had to be the first guy on this list and the QB1 for the all first team.
Absolutely. I mean, when you think about what happened with Baker Mayfield and the receiver situation in terms of Godwin going down with a broken ankle, I believe it was like week 4 or 5, Mike Evans injuring his hamstring, and the supporting cast there, then he had Jalen McMillan, Trey Palmer, Sterling Shepard. I mean, that's not a all-star caliber of receivers. And then you had Kate Otten, who kind of just went up there, and then he was doing so great, also fell off a cliff. So I feel like Baker Mayfield was that lone piece that was propping up the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and he rightfully deserves this credit because his touchdowns were great, his yards were great, and then even then the NFL didn't even recognize him. He got snubbed from the Pro Bowl, but he's our honorable mention.
Definitely. I also feel like going into the season, I didn't really know for sure if I was going to be buying in on the Baker Mayfield hype. Not to say that this was going to be like 2023 was going to be some kind of anomaly season for him, but you take away his play caller, Dave Canales. He goes to Carolina, he's their new head coach. You kind of feel like they should have to miss a beat or skip a beat in some way. And it felt like he was almost just as good as he was the year before, no matter the supporting cast around him. Like Godwin played every game last year, which is a rarity. Had his, trusty play caller in Dave Canals. There was just a lot more that the team had in 2023 versus 2024. And like you said, we didn't really know from week to week what we were getting. Mike Evans goes down with an injury. Chris Godwin goes down with an injury. They're running out a plethora of running backs, and for a while we were confused in the time of like who was going to be their starting back. But it was
Absolutely.
always Baker who delivered. It was always Baker who was super consistent for them, and I feel like that's why Baker does deserve this first team all nomination.
Right. And then just the offensive coordinator, Liam Cohen, I believe he comes from the Sean McVay system as well. So that kind of also propelled him up. So I just love what Baker Mayfield brought to the table this year, given where he was taken and given I guess the question marks surrounding him.
For sure. So now that we got the quarterback out of the way, do you want to go over the first running back on the all first team for studs?
Sure. Again, we try to not put players that are finishing at the top of their position, but I mean, how can you not talk about Saquon Barkley this year? Given that he was a second round pick in most drafts this year, he finishes as the running back one, having 2,000 rushing yards. His receptions were great. I mean, we all know the spectacular hurdle that he had. From a fantasy standpoint, he was averaging, I believe, about 22 points a game, and much higher than the other players finishing before him. So Saquon Barkley was a beast this year. Your thoughts on Saquon Barkley?
So I definitely agreed. When you consider ADP, he was the sixth running back taken off the board. Like you said, a second round pick, not even really like a very desired first round pick in most leagues. Like some people were like, all right, fine. If Saquon Barkley's there, I'll take him. But nobody was going out of their way to make sure that they had Saquon Barkley on their roster at the time. And for him to finish so much better than all of the other running backs, like I get it. Christian McCaffrey had injuries. Brees Hall was a disappointment. Bijan
Get
was
into that.
solid, but he was so much better than everybody else that that's kind of why I felt like we had to put him on the first team because he was just so much better than every other running back.
Rightfully deserved it.
He was like the positional advantage. Like if you had a guy that you knew was much better than everybody else, it was Saquon Barkley, and it was Saquon Barkley by a lot.
Right, and we weren't going into the season thinking that. We were thinking, this guy left the Giants. Sure, the Eagles have their phenomenal offensive line. You have a new offensive coordinator in Kellen Moore. You don't know how he's going to space out his receivers, how he's going to utilize his running back, and it just turns out that, Saquon Barkley took full advantage of the new offensive coordinator, the new team, and the phenomenal offensive line the Eagles have.
For sure, I can't even lie. I was somebody that was like, I don't know, the tush push is a thing, but that was kind of like nipped in the butt right away. Like it didn't matter how many rushing touchdowns Jalen Hurts had. Saquon Barkley was going to be the best running back, and we kind of knew that after like what, 3, 4 weeks of the season that we knew this was
Absolutely.
it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I had the same thought process because I believe the year before I took him pretty early. I love Saquon Barkley. I love the talent from Penn State, but I had my doubts only because of, that tush push. That's rushing touchdowns that can be just not that we didn't factor that in, but turned out to not even be an issue.
Moving on to the next running back that makes the all first studs team. I don't know too much how you feel about this one, Eber. I felt that Josh Jacobs had to be on this list. When you consider this guy was drafted as the 12th running back off of the board. So now we're not even talking about a second round pick. We're talking about like a mid third round pick, somebody that I was afraid to take, somebody that I felt like age was definitely in the factor of consideration for him in terms of like, is this going to be like a down season with all the volume he's had in his career? And he absolutely smashed. He had 15 total touchdowns, finished as the RB6 overall, and I felt that he had to make this all first team. What are your thoughts?
I agree there. My only doubts were, in the beginning of the year, he had that the few game stretch where he just wasn't getting any touchdowns, and all those touchdowns kind of came in the back half of the season. But when you're thinking about fantasy, sure, you want to win those early matchups. Yes, you want to get the points, you want to be atop the standings, but you're going into those later weeks. That's kind of when you're starting to get your playoff momentum. And I feel like Josh Jacobs just got hot at the right time. He became very involved in the passing game, and the offensive line started to gel, and he essentially just became the Green Bay Packers offense. As he went, that offensive went. They developed a play action to Christian Washington and Jaden Reed, and he just was really just physical dominant force. And from a fantasy standpoint, he finished higher than where we all thought he would finish. And we had our doubts. I mean, you're going from a Raiders team that's not great, but you're the only offensive piece there. So obviously your numbers are going to be somewhat inflated, and then you're going to a Packers team that's super diverse at spreading the ball. So and then you take in a Marshawn Lloyd and then Emmanuel Wilson as well. When you have all those pieces, you don't really know which way they're going to go. So I was very surprised to see him finish where he did, and he again another one who deserves to be in the all studs list.
I also wanted to talk about how we all kind of felt like Jordan Love was going to take a step forward in terms of like fantasy production. No, that may not have happened because Josh Jacobs stole the shine from Jordan Love, but we all thought that like Jordan Love was going to elevate the wide receivers and that we were going to have multiple, startable wide receivers in this Packers offense, and that never really got to come to fruition because Josh Jacobs was just the guy. He was the bell cow. He was everything you drafted him for, and that's why I
Mhm.
felt like we had to put Josh Jacobs on this list.
Yeah, he was the juice of this offense.
Do you want to take us into the wide receiver position now?
Sure. I'm going to go a little off schedule here. One guy I was banging the drum for all summer, and he turned out to be a stud. LSU just knows how to produce wide receivers. And no, it's not Malik Neighbors, it's Brian Thomas Jr. Brian Thomas Jr. turned out to be an absolute stud. When you consider about where he was getting taken, I believe it was like round 10, round 9, and then in that range. He finishes with 80 catches for almost 1,180 yards and 10 touchdowns. His quarterback situation wasn't great. You have Trevor Lawrence playing, you have Trevor Lawrence missing games, you have Mac Jones stepping in. We already know what Mac Jones is. So, given all of that, he plays in a division where he has to go up against a guy like Derek Stingley Jr. He's not like getting these easy cornerback matchups. And from a fantasy perspective, he just turned out to be a absolute gem. Finished, I believe, wide receiver 4 or something like that. But he just turned like for in terms of value, this is a guy you were taking to be a bench piece. You had unknowns in terms of where you're going to play him. Is he going to be a flex for you? Are you going to drop him? Turns out to be he's your wide receiver 1 on some teams. Thoughts
So
on Brian Thomas?
I totally agree with everything you just said. For him to finish inside the top five of wide receivers, the ADP kind of baked into the fact that, like you said, we don't really know what the quarterback play was going to look like. We didn't know how well of a team Jacksonville was going to be. It's also a rookie, so kind of fluctuates where you would take him just because of that alone. And for him to be, it almost felt like he was matchup proof, like you're mentioning about how he had to go up against tough corners. For somebody like me who drafted him and then unfortunately, I traded him away to you, but it was all good at the end of the day. Brian Thomas Jr. felt like he was matchup proof. It was just like every game, I was like, all right, here's the tough matchup this week. Do I play him? Do I not play him? Is he still going to be that guy? And every single week, he was that guy. And it shows in his wide receiver four finish this year. No matter who he played, no matter who he was going up against, he absolutely dominated. Quarterback play aside, like you just said, Brian Thomas Jr. was amazing.
Agreed. Brian Thomas Jr., like he smashed. Just that's what you want in fantasy. You want guys that you can get in those later rounds that are gonna propel you to a fantasy playoffs and a fantasy championship. And he was that guy.
I agree. And given his ADP, he kind of fits the absolute definition of what we wanted to accomplish with this first team all studs team. It's supposed to be guys that you didn't draft. People, like you said, you don't really have too high of expectations for, and then they just end up being a staple of your fantasy lineup. So I felt like Brian Thomas Jr. had to make the all first studs team this year.
For sure. And even like you think about the real draft, the NFL draft, it was Marvin Harrison, it was Malik Neighbors, and then he went, it was Roma Dunze, and then he went fourth. So even in terms of NFL GMs, NFL rankings, he wasn't that high on their boards. And to see that translate to such a productive rookie year, I'm just very excited to see what happens in the subsequent years to come in this Jacksonville offense and for him as a player.
I agree. And from one LSU brother to another, I know he finished as wide receiver one overall, but we just have to talk about Jamarr Chase, and Jamarr Chase has to make the first team all studs list for this year. I mean, when you go and you look at his stats overall, he finished so much better than every other wide receiver, almost 60, 70 points more than Justin Jefferson, the next guy. And for your wide receiver to only be outscored by two players at any position in fantasy, and that is Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson, you basically had the hottest commodity in Jamar Chase. I mean, going into the year, there were contract
Mhm.
negotiations that were affecting his ADP. He was the fourth wide receiver taken in draft, so it's not that you got an absolute bargain for him. But when you think about how you got a bargain actually, because you took him in the middle of your first round and he was
Sure.
so much better than everybody else, that's why I felt like, and we both felt like
Mhm.
Jamar Chase had to be on this team. What are your thoughts about Chase?
Absolutely. And going to our draft or any mock draft that I did, it was always he was in the back half of that first round. People weren't taking him in that first three, where it was CMC, Tyreek Hill, CeeDee Lamb. He was kind of an afterthought. And even when you get away from those players, it was more like a Bijan and a Breece Hall that were getting taken. Like he was just an afterthought. And I know it's like it's repetitive, but it's like he's an extremely, extremely impressive talent. I think he also benefited from the fact that T. Higgins missed games, so he was the de facto wide receiver one. He was getting targeted an insane amount. I remember I still have vision of that game. It was a Thursday game, and he just scored like 40 something points. I mean, he was just an absolute monster. And again, yes, you want that from a wide receiver that you're taking in the first round. But when you think to the guys that were taken before him, that first five guys, they didn't even finish remotely close to their ADP or remotely close to what we expected from a fantasy value. So Jamar Chase was just an absolute steal this year in the terms of, I mean, you have Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, both of those guys throw the ball, they put up yards, they can run the ball, and they can have rushing touchdowns. And the fact that you think Jamar Chase is right underneath them in terms of overall fantasy points, that's an impressive feat in itself.
For the next wide receiver on this list, I felt like this was a no-brainer given that where he was drafted, where he finished, for somebody to be in those like seventh, eighth, maybe even ninth rounds in your league, for Jackson Smith-Njigba to finish where he did it at wide receiver seven overall in terms of PPR, of course, JSN had to make this list. When DK Metcalf went down with an injury, JSN was the only guy there, and JSN had to deliver. This was an offense that really didn't look anything like they were supposed to be last year. Hiring a new offensive coordinator, I mean, a new head coach, I'm sorry, who was a stellar offensive coordinator at Washington. It felt like we didn't really know exactly what the true potential of this offense was going to be. It felt like JSN was more of a dart throw where you drafted him more than anything else. And for him to finish inside the top 10 and have such a season that he did, I felt like JSN had to make this list. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely, and you were correct. It was a brand new head coach, and Ryan Grubbs was a brand new offensive coordinator. I mean, they took him from the University of Washington. So I get what you're saying in the sense of there's just so much unknown. How does the college offensive coordinator translate to the NFL, right? So then you have a DK Metcalf. He's a proven one. A Tyler Lockett, an experienced veteran. He's going to start as your wide receiver too. And then you factor Jason, a raw talent from Ohio State. I mean, he's super good. We just didn't ever get a chance to see it when Shane Waldron was there. And JSN kind of alluded to that. There was a lot of rumors that he wasn't at his full potential. And then you see this explosion. I mean, he just went crazy. He went nuclear. And I was a guy, kind of like you. I love JSN, the talent. I wasn't sure of JSN in the situation. So seeing what happened and how it kind of came a full circle moment for him where he's doing what he did at Ohio State. I mean, he put up the best numbers of his career. We're seeing this electric player. That's why he was taken as the 20th overall pick in the NFL draft. I mean, he's just so talented. He's so good. And like you said, you alluded to this. DK Metcalf goes down. You don't know what this offense is going to look like, whether it's going to be handing the ball off to Kenneth Walker or they're going to try to mix it up a little bit. And Geno Smith is his quarterback. So it's not like he has a Mahomes or a Josh Allen type of guy throwing to him. You have a guy who reinvented his career in Seattle. You don't always know what you're getting from him in a week-to-week basis. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because when you don't know what you're going to get from him, you don't know how the receiver production is going to be. But JSN crushed in every statistical category that you could. And now seeing him in the top 10, it makes me look very, very foolish. As a Ken Walker owner, I traded JSN for Zach Charbonnet. So knowing now the season he had, I don't know. He's definitely going to be going up on draft boards next year, and people are going to snag him early.
And don't be too hard on yourself because I know you made that trade when DK Metcalf was absolutely balling out. So
Yeah.
it's not like you could have predicted an injury. You were really just making sure that you had your insurance policy. And
Yeah,
as we all know now, is Zach Charbonnet is one of the best insurance policies that you could have even had on the market. Like, let's just call it what it is.
right.
But for people like us who know football and obviously aren't coaches, it to us in theory, when DK Metcalf goes down with an injury, for football fans like us, it's like, okay, just bracket JSN. Have somebody following him over the top. Like, obviously, we know that they're going to give him more volume, but for guys like us, we're just like, okay, it really shouldn't be JSN breaks out now because you have one less, real threat at wide receiver to worry about. You just put a safety over the top, have a man in front of him also, and JSN shouldn't be able to do anything, right? That's the total opposite. He absolutely dominated every single game that DK Metcalf wasn't on the field. And then when DK Metcalf came back, he still dominated those games.
Exactly.
So it was like just a season that shouldn't have been possible, but given the talent and given how good of a player he was and how good the situation was for him this year in 2024 versus 2023, JSN absolutely smashed and definitely deserved to be on this list.
100%. And he's just so versatile. You can keep him outside as a true wide receiver two on a boundary, or you can move him in the slot. And that's what I love about him. He's just so versatile and he's so good at any place that you put him on the field. And I'm glad to see it all come together for him. I think what we have tight end next
Yes.
for the all studs list. So I would say our stud of tight end would be Brock Bowers. You agree with that?
I definitely agree with that. I understand that he finished at one. It might be a little bit of a low-hanging fruit, like just grab the best guy and put him on this list. But when you consider he was not even one of the first 10 tight ends drafted last year in fantasy, and you got the best guy, and it wasn't like he was the best by a few points. He was clearly the best tight end. He was, in conversations with, wide receivers in terms of fantasy points. He had more fantasy points than Terry McLaurin.
Which is insane.
And
Insane.
Terry McLaurin was, borderline top five guy. Granted, if he had a better week, in week 17, he's probably a top five wide receiver. So for him to be like flirting with top 5 wide receiver numbers and being a tight end, usually that's not something that usually happens in terms of fantasy points scoring. Brock Bowers was so amazing that it didn't even matter that he was a tight end. Like even if he was a wide receiver, he could have made this list off being a wide receiver. What are your thoughts about Bowers?
100%. And when you think about a guy like Brock Bowers, the quarterback situation is abysmal for the Raiders. I mean, you don't know who's starting which week. You don't know which guy they're getting from the waiver wire, what they're doing. So the fact that he was able to carve out such a large role as a rookie, considering they drafted a guy like Michael Mayer the year before from Notre Dame, and they had high aspirations for him. I don't know what happened. I guess it didn't pan out, but Brock Bowers seems to be that generational talent from Georgia. And you saw it here, like exactly how he produced in college his game just smoothly translated in terms of the NFL. And for Bowers, he had 144 targets. The reason I'm bringing that up is when you think of a guy like the year before, Evan Ingram. Evan Ingram for the Jags also had 144 targets, and he finished, I think it was tight end five the year before. Brock Bowers took his targets, took his touchdowns, and he finished as a number one tight end. So, I mean, for the value that he is, it would be disrespectful to not put him on this list.
Let's move on to the flex. So obviously this could have been a running back, wide receiver, or tight end, but I think one name above all that deserved to be on the first team kind of was snubbed by Saquon Barkley because he was just so good this year is Chase Brown, who, if you drafted him, he was the 30th running back coming off the board. He was the definition of a middle round pick with the potential of the unknown. Like plenty of people were talking about Chase Brown hyping him up in the offseason. Usually that's not always the best sign because those guys that get hyped up in, July and beginning of August are usually guys that aren't staples in fantasy. But once Chase Brown got the starting job, once he took over and started getting the volume that he did not look back. For someone like him to not even really start the entire season as like the primary running back and finish at RB10 overall is just truly remarkable. And that's why he's got to be on the first team all studs. What do you think?
Uh, couldn't agree with you more. You know, when we were talking about this, we were going back and forth. Who do we want to put here? I mean, there's no one I think that's more deserving than Chase Brown to be here because you see, like you alluded to, the hype in the summer. But at the same time, Zach Moss was there, right? And before he got injured, it was Zach Moss. It was kind of like this 50-50 split or whatever it was. And then he goes down with injury. And you just can't envision a world where you see Chase Brown getting all the carries, all the dump offs. He's fully involved in the passing game, the running game. It's his backfield. He had 100% share. He had no one to split it with. So, and when you really think about it, that he didn't start out as that starting running back, like you said, he just took full advantage of his opportunity. And for him to be in that top 10 conversation, I mean, he again, another guy who deserves to be there. So Chase Brown is a dog, and I don't know what's going to happen next year in this Cincinnati backfield, given I don't know if there's going to be any coaching changes or whatnot. But even I had my like doubts originally because they also traded for Khalil Herbert. And we know Khalil Herbert's kind of a talented guy as well. So I thought he was going to kind of cut into that workload, but he didn't. And just Chase Brown just took over. And it's just like, man, good for you. Like you could be a league winner for many teams.
You want to go over the honorable mentions with me really quick? The honorable mentions, guys that we really wanted to put on this first team all studs, but unfortunately just couldn't make the cut. So first we have Jaden Daniels. And like I mentioned with the quarterback position earlier, there were a lot of guys I wanted to put on this list. I even wanted to put Jared Goff on this list just because of where Jared Goff was drafted and where he finished. But for somebody like Jaden Daniels to finish as a top five quarterback, even though he was the 10th quarterback drafted in most leagues in terms of ADP. For somebody to have that kind of turnaround and be that good, regardless of, it's your rookie season, your second season, whatever the
Yeah,
case may be, to finish inside the top five is extremely impressive. And that's why he had to be an honorable mention here.
for sure. And when you think about his rushing upside, I mean, he had more rushing yards than Lamar Jackson this year. That speaks volumes. So he also had, I believe, two more rushing touchdowns than Lamar, six going up against four. So, I mean, Jaden Daniels, especially with his ADP, I mean, I wish we can put him there, but just Baker Mayfield was more of a value in terms of the position, but Jaden Daniels really, really balled out.
For sure. And let's not forget that right after Jaden Daniels had that rib tissue injury of some
Yeah.
sort,
Hmm.
he almost felt like he was going to fall off and then not get back to where he was. So you had a couple weeks where you're like, I don't know, but like Baker Mayfield was just always ripping the ball. Like he was just always consistently really good. So I felt like that's another reason why, even though it's not the most logical reason, that was a reason that I felt like Baker had to be there because he was just so consistent throughout the year and taken even later.
Absolutely. And even with Jaden Daniels, when he had that soft tissue, the rib injury, whatever it was, in the sense that you would think his rushing production would dip, and it did for the first like 2 or 3 weeks, and then we kind of saw it go back up as he started to get healthier.
So the running back that I wanted to put on this list, unfortunately, couldn't make the list was Alvin Kamara. When you talk about somebody that nobody really expected a top 10 finish from, Alvin Kamara definitely checks that box, given his age, given his ADP, given the team overall, like the New Orleans Saints. Like, do you really want a New Orleans Saints player in fantasy? Like, I know Chris Olave had a high ADP, but like even then we were like, like I don't really know about Chris Olave. For Alvin Kamara to absolutely smash and just not miss a beat and look like his old self was truly amazing at this point in his fantasy football career and his football career. And I felt like he just had to be an honorable mention here.
Absolutely. And like you said, given his age, reports coming out in the summer that he's having back issues, he's having this injury, or like he's not 100%. And seeing the guys going ahead of him in drafts with like Rashad White, Ken Walker, James Cook, he really smashed. And he had those couple weeks where he torched the Cowboys for he had 40 something fantasy points. He was just super, super consistent. And I didn't expect Alvin Kamara to have this type of consistent level of play like he's had in years past. So it was good to see. And another guy, if we had more spots, we'd put him there.
For sure. And like we talked about off air, if you were to tell me in August when I'm drafting my team that Alvin Kamara would have finished better than James Cook, I would have been like, what are you smoking? Like, there's no way that's going to happen. And somehow, some way, it did. And
Because
even with James Cook's 17 touchdowns combined, Alvin Kamara was still better than him. Like, that's just a crazy thought to think about.
100%.
The wide receiver that we wanted to put on this list, but unfortunately just didn't get to make the cut with, Chase Brown stealing that last flex spot, is Malik Neighbors. Now, Malik Neighbors wasn't somebody drafted extremely late, but given that where he finished and given the Giants offense and all the uncertainties that come along with it, and for him to just go out every single week and just dominate, Malik Neighbors had to be on this list.
Agreed. Given the fact that he also missed a few games with a concussion and also like shaky quarterback play, Brian Dable, shaky offensive play calling. And he just, again, another guy who you were taking in that round three, round four, but you weren't sure what you were getting with him. And he just, again, smashed his ADP, his value. And another LSU guy. I don't know what they have down there in Louisiana, but them boys are feasting.
Yeah, they're built different from LSU. I will definitely say that much. Closing out the list for the tight end position, somebody I was very high on.
Yeah,
I
you are.
tried to I tried to scream it from the rooftops. Draft Jonnu Smith. Draft Jonnu Smith. He was the best tight end from week 9 on. I mean, this is a
Mhm.
guy, Jonnu Smith, absolutely smashed expectations. Somebody that wasn't even drafted, somebody that was considered an afterthought behind Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle and Devon Achane and even Raheem Mostert at the time. People thought Mostert and Achane would be more involved than Jonnu, and like Jonnu just absolutely smashed this year. I'm so happy for him. Like I said in the last video that we made together, for a vertical tight end to join a vertical offense, to me was a no-brainer. This is the perfect fit. This is going to work in harmony. What are your thoughts about Jonnu Smith in his 2024 season?
And you are 100% correct. And I give you your flowers because he had 79 catches on 99 targets, and he had roughly about 204 fantasy points, finishing as a tight end four. So, I mean, considering this is a guy that wasn't drafted and he was on your waiver wire for the first 2 months of the season, I mean, it's so impressive to see you finish in the top five, let alone be the tight end one from week 9 onward.
I really hope you guys enjoyed me and Eber chopping it up, going over our first team all studs list. I had to break up our call into two different videos. So this first half of the video is first team all studs. I will be working on the next video as you are watching this video right now. And we're going to go over the first team all duds. We're going to go over fantasy MVP, fantasy rookie of the year, and waiver wire pickup of the year. So I don't have an outro recorded for us in that video. We do have an outro recorded in the next segment of the video. Shouts out to Dr. Eber for holding it down for us, giving us such good information. He's very detailed, very well thought out in everything he says. And I just can't thank him enough for joining the show. You guys know the drill. If you're new to the channel, make sure you smash that subscribe button down below. If you've been subscribed, make sure you smash that like button so I know to keep bringing Eber on the channel as much as possible. But anyways, my name is Turtle, this is Ally Fantasy, and I will see you in the next video.